So transitioning to the muscles of the trunk, we'll start with the pectoralis major muscle. This is the large muscle that's on the anterior chest. So this muscle actually crosses over and inserts on the humerus, and so when this muscle contracts, the chest is the origin of this muscle, which means it's the immovable attachment point of this muscle. And so you will see all of its major actions are on the arm because its insertion point is on the arm. So what this muscle does when it contracts is that it flexes the arm. So think of like raising the arm from the anatomical position that you see it in now. Think of it as like raising the arm up so that it is so that the arm is roughly parallel with the shoulder, kind of towards the front of the body. But it also adducts the arm as well, so that as if the arm was extended out laterally from the body and this muscle were to contract, it would pull the arm back towards anatomical position. Next, we have the deltoid muscle, which is this triangular muscle that sits on the shoulder. It also attaches to the humerus from the shoulder joint. So when it contracts, it's going to influence what the humerus is doing, or it's going to influence the movement of the humerus at the shoulder joint here. So being laterally located on the arm from the shoulder joint, that means that when this muscle shortens and contracts, it's going to abduct the arm and the upper limb. And so we're gonna see that it raises the arm and the upper limb laterally from anatomical position. The last major muscle that we can see on this particular diagram here is the biceps brachii muscle, which is the large muscle that sits on the anterior part of the arm, so kind of just above the right in the middle of the humerus, really, just above the elbow joint. It is called the biceps muscle because bi means two, and seps refers to heads, and so this muscle actually has two divisions or heads, and what this muscle ends up actually doing is that it sits on the arm and it actually crosses the elbow joint here. You can't really see it too well in the bottom part of this diagram here, but it crosses the elbow joint. So it sits on the humerus, crosses the elbow joint. So that means it's going to have influence on the forearm when it contracts. And when it contracts, it flexes the forearm at the elbow joint. Now, I know it's pretty common to say that this muscle flexes the arm, but remember that the arm refers to the humerus bone because the humerus is between the elbow and the shoulder joint. The biceps brachii actually has very little influence on what the arm is doing because it's sitting on the arm, but because it inserts below the elbow joint, it actually inserts on the radius bone, and so when it contracts, it actually has more influence on the forearm than it does on the arm itself. So this is a forearm flexor muscle. So the major muscle that's kind of turning our attention to the posterior part of the arm, the major muscle that's found on the posterior part of the arm is the triceps brachii muscle, which is an antagonist to the biceps brachii muscle that we saw on the anterior part of the arm. So it is called the triceps muscle because it has three heads instead of two, like the biceps does. The biceps has two heads, triceps has three heads. There are only two heads that are actually visible in this particular diagram here. But in much the same way that the biceps brachii crosses the elbow joint at the front of the arm, this muscle also crosses the elbow joint, but on the posterior side of the elbow joint rather than the anterior side of the elbow joint. So this means that the triceps is an antagonist to our biceps muscle. So when the triceps muscle contracts, it actually serves to extend the elbow joint, whereas the biceps brachii muscle flexed the elbow joint here. So when the muscle shortens, what it ends up doing is it ends up pulling the posterior part of the elbow closer to the back part of the humerus here. So that's a pretty easy way to visualize its movement. Okay, so we've seen kind of the major muscles of at least the upper part of the arm and the shoulder joint. So let's turn our attention to the posterior part of the trunk and the lower back. One of the major muscles that we can see, we really see kind of two major muscles here, the latissimus dorsi on the lower part of the trunk and the trapezius on the upper part of the trunk. If we focus on the latissimus dorsi for a second, this is a very large superficial muscle. It's a very powerful muscle that attaches to the arm. You can see that its main kind of origin point is off of the pelvic bones and or the coxal bones here, and the vertebral column as well. So this is really kind of the immovable part of the muscle here. But you can see that all of its fibers kind of converge on the medial part of the humerus just underneath the axillary, or just behind or underneath the axilla or the armpit. And so notice that it attaches to the arm. So that means that when this muscle contracts and pulls, it's going to have action on the arm when it contracts. So specifically, the latissimus dorsi helps to extend the arm. That is, if the arm was kind of raised up and forward, essentially kind of parallel to the shoulder joint, when this muscle contracts, it's going to extend the arm and bring it back down to the anatomical position that you see it in right now. It's also going to serve to adduct the arm as well. So if the arm were extended out laterally here in an abducted state, it would help to bring the arm back to its anatomical position as you see it right here. So that is the latissimus dorsi. Let's reflect here on the trapezius muscle for a second. So just superior to our latissimus dorsi is this large trapezoid-shaped muscle called the trapezius muscle, and this covers most of the upper part of the back and the back part of the neck as well. So its origin point is mostly on the vertebral column here. So the vertebral column is really not going to do a lot of movement when this muscle contracts, but you can see that it actually inserts on the scapula. And so that means that when this muscle contracts, it's going to pull the scapula. And what it ends up doing is actually ends up elevating the scapula. So if you were kind of imagine the upper part of a shrug movement with your shoulders, then that upper movement would be the elevation of the scapula. So that is one of its actions. The other action that it has is it has action on the neck as well. And so when it contracts, it actually extends the neck, which means that if you were looking down, extension of the neck would be movement of your head from that looking down position to looking forward, and returning the head and neck back to their anatomical position if you were looking down. So that is the trapezius muscle. So let's return to the anterior side of the abdomen. Real briefly, we find a couple of major muscles here. One of them is kind of more medially located, and it's a very long, straight muscle called the rectus abdominis muscle. This word rectus actually means straight, so this is the straight muscle of the abdomen. And this is the muscle that flexes the trunk when it contracts. And so if you think kind of a bending forward movement at essentially the belly button or the navel, then this would represent the action of this particular muscle here. Laterally and more superficially, we encounter and they kind of cut it away here, so it's difficult to see the whole muscle here. But normally covering kind of the exterior or I guess I should say superficial and lateral part of the trunk here is the external oblique muscle. And so this muscle is a synergist to the rectus abdominis muscle, because when the external oblique muscle contracts, it also flexes the trunk. But because of its lateral position on the abdomen, it actually serves to rotate the trunk in the left or right directions as well.